My talk is going to be about intermittent fasting versus Ramadan fasting, and the question is, are they different? This is a question Dr. Muhammad Hassanain wanted me to deal with, and I'm going to deal with that as myself, as a simple man. So this is a simple man's account on something that, as Professor Walid said, is becoming actually very popular. I don't have any conflict of interest to declare. I start answering this question by looking at what other people have done. I do a PubMed search. And on my PubMed search, I looked under the title Ramadan. This is just about a couple of weeks ago, and I found 1,242 papers. So looking for Ramadan fasting as a title, you find 743, intermittent fasting at 499, Ramadan and intermittent fasting 65. So clearly, some of us are actually tying the two together, Ramadan and intermittent fasting. So you see in some of the papers that are published, Ramadan as referred to as not just Ramadan fasting, but as Ramadan intermittent fasting. But are they actually the same? Are they different? So these are some of the common forms of eating patterns in humans. The normal eating pattern that we have right at the top, eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and feeling kind of free to eat in between, is associated with lots of benefits and joys, but is also causing obesity and cardiometabolic problems. Ramadan fasting is quite unique in many ways, and it has some similarities to intermittent fasting, and I'll be dealing with those two. I don't really need to tell this audience what Ramadan fasting entails, but I will point out some of the aspects of Ramadan fasting as we go along. And I will be going slowly. As I said, I'm going to present this as a simple man's account. So let's just look at intermittent fasting. A simple man would look at Wikipedia for the definition of intermittent fasting. I'm not a nutritionist. And this is what the Wikipedia says. Intermittent fasting is defined as any of various meal timing schedules that cycle between voluntary fasting or reduced calorie intake and non-fasting over a given period. It involves food and fluid restriction, but calories on fasting periods can be up to 25% of regular times, and on non-fasting days ad libitum, or limited to certain types of food and food compositions. What do others say? If you go on the internet, there's lots of good claims about intermittent fasting. And this is from one such page, but before I actually present what these claims are, I must also say that a lot of these claims actually have good, or at least some evidence to back them up. So intermittent fasting is supposed to change the function of hormones, cells, and genes, help lose weight and visceral fat. The weight loss is kind of modest, but nevertheless, in many forms of intermittent fasting, you do see that. Visceral fat change in different forms of intermittent fasting can be different. Can reduce insulin resistance, and certainly that is the case. Lowering risk of type 2 diabetes, that also seems to be the case. Can reduce oxidative stress and inflammation in the body, and may be beneficial for heart health. Can induce various cellular repair processes, may help prevent cancers, and there's in fact good evidence for that also. Can benefit brain, can prevent Alzheimer's disease, and may extend longevity. This is the family of intermittent fasting. There are three common and more popular forms of intermittent fasting. Whole day fasting, and a common one that a lot of us know very much about is the 5-2 fasting. So fasting outside of Ramadan on Mondays and Thursdays, but other days eating as kind of normal. Alternate day fasting, which speaks for itself. The only thing that I have to say is that, when you're talking about alternate day fasting, that is not necessarily full fasting like we do on Ramadan days. So on fasting days, depending on the regime, the person can be allowed to have some food, some energy, and some fluid, but much less than the non-fasting days. And time-restricted feeding is one that has been gaining popularity. So typically, the person will be fasting 16 out to 24 hours. So 8 or 9 hours will be spent in a time window where they can actually be eating, and that can start at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, or around noon, 12 o'clock, or 1 o'clock, and can last 8 or 9 hours thereafter. So where does Ramadan fasting come in all of this? Is Ramadan fasting a type of time-restricted feeding? Or is it different and has a place of its own, but still under the intermittent fasting family? Let's talk about time-restricted fasting a little bit and compare it with Ramadan-type fasting. So let's just look at a 24-hour clock. This is Ramadan fasting on your left, familiar to most of you. So we are allowed to eat between iftar time around 7 o'clock to about 4 o'clock in the morning in the UAE, depending on the season, of course. So what that means is that you have a time window of around 9 hours to eat, but most of the day, well, actually all of the daylight hours plus a little bit more, you are actually fasting, and that fasting is quite strict. You're not eating anything. Early time-restricted feeding, you just contrast that with our Ramadan type of fasting. And what you can see there is very obvious, the kind of mirror images of each other, almost opposite of each other. So typically, early time-restricted fasting involves 8 or 9 hours of eating early during the day, starting 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning to about 5 p.m. So it actually is kind of reverse of what we do during Ramadan. And we have late or delayed time-restricted feeding, which is somewhere in between. Typically, again, 8 or 9 hours of eating, starting late during the day, around noon, and it lasts until 9 a.m. So Ramadan, early TRF, and late TRF. And here they are, if you just put them all together so you can actually compare. Ramadan, early TRF, late TRF, and the ring right in the periphery is actually Ramadan with long hours, like you would see in high latitudes. For example, people who have lived in Scotland, or people who lived even further north, Sweden or Norway, they would be familiar with such very, very long hours. Let's just introduce ourselves to the concept of chrononutrition. The fact is that when we eat is as critical as what and how much we eat for chronic disease progression. Circadian clock tightly interacts with metabolic functions, and meal timing is important for metabolic regulation. On the right panel, what you can see is a 24-hour clock and how it relates to various endocrine functions. So peak endocrine functions happen at different times of that 24-hour clock, and by implication, when you eat during those times might have relevance to your health and to disease. So, for example, the easy example is the insulin peaks with eating. So if you change your eating times, your insulin peaks will also change. Your testosterone tends to peak around 9 o'clock in the morning. Peak alertness is 10 o'clock in the morning. Your cortisol secretion begins at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then you have melatonin around 9 o'clock, for example, at night that reaches starts secretion. So we know that eating can influence some of those hormone functions. So the concept is that when we eat is as critical to chronic disease progression and to health as what and how much. And the question is, what is the relevance of that to Ramadan type fasting? as far as I know, nobody has specifically looked at Ramadan in that context, and it's something that I've suggested to one of the journals I'm affiliated with, that I would be wanting to deal with, and anybody wants to sort of help me with that, you're welcome. But I think that would be quite an interesting concept. So if I go back to this, not this one, then I think it would be interesting to compare, for example, Ramadan with early TRF or even late TRF, and see, how different forms of fasting actually are going to be affecting different things. No head-to-head comparison has been done, but I think that is something that is worth doing. Now I'm just going to move forward. Let's just look at some studies. Just conscious of time. Okay, I have plenty of time. Let's look at time-restricted feeding. And this particular study, published in Obesity in 2019, looked at the effect of time-restricted feeding, early time-restricted feeding versus late time-restricted feeding or delayed time-restricted feeding, on glucose tolerance in men at risk of type 2 diabetes. That would be men with pre-diabetes. So look at the panel A, glucose. So what you can see is that the bullet points, the black bullet points are clearly higher than the empty bullet points. And the empty bullet points actually represent day 7 of the time-restricted feeding, either early or late. So what that says is that your glucose tolerance in response to a test meal, this is in response to a test meal as opposed to glucose, is actually lower. So what that means is that your glucose tolerance actually improves with both forms of time-restricted feeding. So 36% reduction in glucose area under the curve for early, and 21% reduction in glucose area under the curve for late TRF. And to kind of go along with that, what you would expect is that your insulin levels would be doing exactly the opposite of your glucose, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. That did not happen. And that's very interesting. And you would just think, if there's an improvement in your glucose tolerance, and that is not mediated by insulin, what is that mediated through? So this was a very good study. They looked at all the gut hormones that you think might be relevant there, and they looked at, for example, ghrelin, GLP-1, GIP, as well as PYY and amylin. And there was a slight difference between, for example, ghrelin with time-restricted fasting, but as you can see, that it doesn't seem to be particularly gross. And it may be that the weight loss that happened with time-restricted fasting was responsible either directly or indirectly for changes in insulin resistance that may account for that improvement in glucose tolerance. So in the early TRF group, fasting glucose as measured by continuous glucose monitoring, that all these subjects were actually improved. And in fact, comparing the profile, the glucose profiles through the CGM, actually there was a significant difference also. How about alternate day fasting? This is an interesting study and quite a busy slide. So let me just try and take you through it. So let's look at the legend first. So you look at prescribed. You're looking at prescribed energy intake in blue or the dark blue, and versus actual energy intake in orange. So you can see that the duration of the study is 1 whole year, 12 months, and there is a weight loss phase for the fasting, and then there's a weight maintenance phase, and there's different energy prescriptions for those two phases. So what you can see in all of those panels, except the one on the right, is that there is a difference between the oranges and the dark blue or the blacks. So in favor of the orange being higher on the left-hand panel, and the orange being lower in the middle panel. So what this means is that your energy prescription is different from what you're actually eating on the days of the fast and on the days of the feast. So there's a difference. This is alternate day fasting. So one day the patient or the person, the volunteer, is fasting. The next day they are not fasting, they are feasting. So on the fasting days, they actually are eating more than the prescribed energy intake they're supposed to be having. So they're feeling more hungry, they're eating a little bit more. Whereas on the feast days, they're actually eating less, which is very interesting. So they're allowed to eat more, but they're eating less. So that is quite an immediate effect that you can see in response to that kind of fasting. Whereas in the calorie restriction, continuous calorie restriction group, the two groups are actually the energy restriction, the energy intake versus energy prescribed are actually the same, more or less. So that is quite an interesting concept. So if you are fasting alternate days, on the days that you're not fasting, you tend to actually eat less than you would otherwise. And this is the effect on weight of those two interventions. The alternate day fasting group and the daily calorie restriction group. So both of them in the first phase of the study, where there is restriction and the weight loss phase, both of them lost a significant amount of weight. So you can see that's around 5-6% of what body weight. But in the weight maintenance, they kind of maintained it, and there wasn't much of a difference between the two groups. So alternate day fasting versus continuous glucose restriction, both of them seem to be effective strategies to some extent for weight loss, but there isn't much of a difference. So here is a kind of a summary: alternate day fasting versus daily calorie restriction, similar adherence, significant but similar weight loss in both groups, weight maintenance, and improvement to CV risk indicators, which I haven't shown. Ramadan fasting is our bread and butter. I mean, we know about Ramadan fasting, and some of these slides, I know a lot of you will be familiar with, and I have, in fact, to confess that I've shown them in my previous talks. But just a reminder that there are certain things that happen to our very familiar hormones, leptin and adiponectin and others. So what happens to leptin? You can see that the rhythm of leptin during Ramadan compared to Sha'ban, where people are not fasting, actually changes. There's much higher leptin level in the morning compared to the evening during Ramadan, for example. And there are also changes to adiponectin, and you can see the significance there. And this is quite a good study from Ajab Noor, and it's a very good group that have done quite a lot of this, and they might be actually in the audience. And this is another one from Bahijri group. Again, Dr. Ajab Noor is also there, and they've done really very, very good studies. Here they've looked at insulin, they've looked at HOMA-IR, and glucose and various other things, including lipid profile. One thing that this study and also other studies show is that insulin resistance actually goes up during Ramadan fasting. And there is a change in your morning to evening cortisol ratio, so the blunting of your peak to trough level. So effect of intermittent fasting on energy expenditure, body composition, it's been looked at by many studies, including meta-analyses and systematic reviews that I know some of the people in the audience would have been party to. So Ramadan fasting is associated with body weight reduction, not a big amount. The net effect is going to be about 1.5 kilogram, and there is a little bit of a difference between female and male. So other studies, no overall effect on resting energy expenditure and total. That was a study of our own a few years ago. Gradual shift from carbohydrate to lipid as dominant fuel as a fasting day progresses. Reduced activity in most individuals. Major change in sleeping pattern and time. But let's go back to the question that was posed in the title of this talk. Intermittent fasting and what is the relationship with Ramadan type fasting. So the big circle here, it's not a circle, it's really an ellipse, is our intermittent fasting. Time-restricted fasting is somewhere there. Early time-restricted fasting is, of course, part of that. Late time-restricted fasting is distinct, but again, part of time-restricted fasting group. And Ramadan fasting is somewhere there, but in some ways close to early TRF, but kind of a mirror image, as I have indicated. Alternate day fasting is different. Periodic fasting is different, but I think that they're probably less popular also. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, Chairman, in people without diabetes, and I stress without diabetes because I think you cannot necessarily generalize what I've said to people with diabetes, intermittent fasting can have major health benefits. Ramadan fasting can be regarded as a variant of time-restricted fasting, and in some ways the reversal of early TRF. Both forms are both forms of intermittent fasting, and TRE has been associated with benefits to cardiometabolic risk. Ramadan is associated with reduced morning to evening cortisol ratio, increased morning to evening leptin ratio, and increased insulin resistance. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention and just thank my team in ICLDC, my research team, particularly Dr. Nader and Bijun, who are somewhere there. And this is not where we do our research. This is sometimes we're allowed to go out, or we used to. This is not to be done these days, of course. These are good old days. And Amin, who helped me with some of those figures. Thank you.